Another use for full irradiance and path tracing is to introduce image-based lighting into the scene. Of course, the normal way of doing this is using environment light. I've got a very simple scene set up here. It's just a teapot on a grid. I've already set up a camera, but there's no lighting in the scene. So let's introduce an environment light. Now, the environment light allows you to set an image map to use as the light source. Now, normally you'd need to create an image map in the so-called lat-long format using the utility that comes with Houdini i6 pack. But fortunately there are some example environments in Houdini, and they're in the pick directory, and they're some samples from DOSH, and the one I'm going to use is the sky scene. Now that is a low resolution picture, but that doesn't matter. In fact, it's quite useful to use a low resolution picture for an area map because it can improve rendering times. So I've set that up. Let's introduce a Mantra rendering node and see what the scene looks like. As you can see, it produces a really nice effect. There's quite a lot of noise which we would need to eliminate by increasing the sampling on our render here, but it produces quite good shadowing, and you can see here a little bit of glossy reflection of the sky. It'd be worth looking perhaps at that sky picture and see what it is that we're rendering from. The picture we're using is this one, and if we have a look here we can see that it's a sky with a sun and a large bright aura around the sun. Let's see how we can use full irradiance to achieve something similar to the environment light. We'll get rid of the environment light, and as before I'll put down a Vex Global Illumination shader and a light template, and we set the shader to the global illumination shader we just laid down. Now if we go into this shader, we're going to use full irradiance. I'm going to reduce the samples. I'm going to turn on adaptive sampling. We can see here we've got this option for an environment map, and that essentially serves the same purpose as our environment light area map. So if I select a sky picture and then render, we can see what that looks like. And here we have it. It looks reasonably similar. The environment light is a lot brighter, and we get this reflection, this specular reflection on the teapot. The path tracing or full irradiance render is darker, and we're not getting the same specularity. We never will get the specularity because irradiance and the global illumination shader are dealing with diffuse illumination. They're not dealing with specular illumination. Let's see whether we can make that look a little bit more like the environment light render. And I'm going to do that by increasing the brightness of the global tint. And I'm going to put it up to a level of 2 and then render. And here's the result. As you can see, it's got a lot brighter, and it's in fact comparable to the environment light result. We're still not getting the specular reflection here, but we wouldn't expect that. Well, you may ask, why bother to use the global illumination shader to produce this effect when you've got an environment light? Well, the only advantage of the global illumination shader is that you can use irradiance caching in the render node to speed up your render. Let's see whether we can smooth out this result a little bit by increasing the number of samples, but also switching on irradiance caching. And I'm going to reduce the parameters here to produce a more accurate result. And let's render that. And that's producing a pretty smooth result, and it rendered in considerably less time than would be the case without irradiance caching. So I've loaded up my original scene, and the final topic we're going to look at is photon mapping. Now, first of all, an explanation of what photon mapping is about. So a word about photon map generation. What happens with photon map generation is that photons are emitted from your light sources, and when they hit an object, a photon is stored in the photon map. It doesn't stop there. That photon is then reflected off your object and might hit another object. Another photon is stored, and so on until the photon either shoots off into empty space or runs out of energy. The color and energy of the photon will diminish with each reflection depending on the nature of the material that it hits. In fact, a very great many photons are generated during photon map generation. It's not uncommon to have up to 1 million photons, each of them stored in your map. What happens when you come to render is that when we render our point that we're interested in, irradiance rays are sent out, or final gathering rays, to put it another way, are sent out into the scene. And when they hit an object, a search is made for nearby photons, and that's used to calculate the indirect illumination at this point, which is then used to affect the intensity of the illumination at the point that we're shading. Note that the photon map only stores, in general, the indirect illumination. The direct illumination is still calculated by the usual method. The first step, of course, is to generate a photon map, and I need to do this by laying down a new mantra node, and I'm going to call it photon. And to generate a photon map, you need to change the rendering engine to photon map generation. The parameters which control how the photon map is generated are here on the PBR tab. The main ones that we're going to be interested in are the photon storage count and the global photon file. This option, cache stores direct lighting, has disappeared in Houdini 10, but in any case we want to disable it when we're using a photon map with the GI light shader. I'm going to reduce the number of photons just to speed up the render, and I'm going to give this a different name. We'll call it Global Room. The options here are to do with how the photon map is optimized for use during the render. I'm going to come on later and explain what the significance of these options is, but for the moment we're going to leave them unchanged. If you want to ensure that every time you render one node, another node is rendered before it, you can connect the two. So what will happen now is when we render the Mantra 1 node, the photon map will always be generated first, and then the Mantra node will be rendered. But first of all, I'm going to just generate the photon map on its own. As you can see, nothing's happened. mplay has not appeared, but it will have dumped a file onto disk.